Okay? They're a lot more angry at Christian Ethiopians than they are at the rest of the world. But by the time you get to North Africa and AQIM, I think you've got a kind of a religious label on top of traditional kidnapping and smuggling thugs. And then by the time you get to Boko Haram, you've got a religious group whose belief system is more founded on the fall of an Islamic empire in what is now northern Nigeria in the 17th and 18th century, more than reestablishing the global caliphate. Now, they all have the brand, more or less. They all more or less pledge formal or informal allegiance. Now, what does that mean for us? And here's the strategic question. People in Pakistan, I think that's very clear, kill them. Right? People in Yemen, the same, kill them. But as you get further west, you have people less committed to the global jihad, more committed to local objectives, or more the creature of local circumstances, for whom the Al-Qaeda brand might actually be, this is probably too strong, but for whom the Al-Qaeda brand might actually be a current flag of convenience. So the question now becomes, as the weight of the movement shifts west, right? How much of an American face do you want to put on dealing with these groups, knowing that if you trigger this too quickly and put an American face on subduing them, you may create an enemy of a group that over time would not have become an enemy of the United States and would have only been a local problem. On the other hand, if you miscalculate and you don't nip it in the bud, one of these small groups is going to grow, gain regional pretensions, and then may actually become like Al-Qaeda Maine. And so that's the question. What do you do with these groups out here? And I don't think the formula that we had to use over here, and we had to because they were committed, I don't think it's the same calculus that you use here in determining what it is we do in the future.
One, I want to bring you in because I think what Mike is saying is that the target list has changed. It's one of the fundamental changes that we've seen. And we've been operating under something called the Authorization to Use Military Force, AUMF. But this is now 12 years old. Do you think we need to have a new definition for who is the target?
Well, Catherine, first of all, thank you. I'm honored to be on this panel. I think if I sent the program to my parents, they'd wonder if there's a typo as to why I'm up here.
And the answer would be yes.
I think you're right. Don't worry, Phil, I'll get you.
Wait, it's early in the panel. We need to
we want the real Jay-Z.
Yeah, exactly.
I am the real Jay-Z. Anyway, at the crux of your question, Catherine, is exactly what the general described, which was a changing shape of the enemy and how we define it. And I think we've struggled with that in the past few years. And I think in many ways we've tried to constrain how we talk about the enemy. The war on Al-Qaeda, in some ways defined by the classic sense of what that has meant historically, what it was on 9/11. And if you look at the authorization is premised on going after those who planned, corroborated, or cooperated with, provided material support for 9/11. And so the key challenge is, how do you define the enemy in 2013 when you still have the Al-Qaeda ideology, you still have a degree of capability, and you're not quite sure how these threats are going to morph? And I think that's one of the challenges, in particular with the president's recent speech, which I think was really important for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons it was so important was he was imagining, I think, an imagining of luxury, but it's still an imagining of a time when we could say the war's over and when we wouldn't need an authorization for the use of military force. I don't think that time is now, because you need those tools to go after the enemies we know about, and you need them to be able to preempt those groups or cells that may actually organize fairly quickly and adapt quickly to attack the U.S. or U.S. interest or our allies, and I think that's important. And a final point, I think in the arc of instability that the general described so well, at the heart of that is now the Levant. Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, in a way that wasn't at play during 9/11 or shortly after 9/11. So I think as we look at the arc of instability and look at how we define the enemy, you have to look at who's flying the banner of Al-Qaeda and how they're adapting in the context of the Syrian conflict and otherwise Because it may be in that zone you have the regeneration and the resurrection of a new brand of al-Qaeda that we have to worry about.
Well, it may be sort of an analogy is that al-Qaeda is like a book and we're finishing discrete chapters within that book because the next set of characters are different from the last. I want to bring you in, Phil, because I know that you have a slightly different view on defining the threat or sort of a lack of a public debate about what the threat looks like.
No, I think I sat in doing the threat matrix for so many years. When you look at what it looked like at the table every night at 5 o'clock in, let's say, 2002 to 2005, 2006, you had a group that had characteristics: visionary leadership, access to money, access to operatives, highly trained people doing things like explosives, access to the West. But fundamentally, they had two advantages. That is, people who had the vision to execute a global strategy, and people had the time and space, what we call in the business, safe haven, to do it. That was initially Afghanistan and then Pakistan. You can think of them as a revolutionary comment. I would say they were not al-Qaeda, they were the beginnings of al-Qaedaism. Today, when you look at what's happened in places afterward, like Indonesia in 2003 and beyond, then when we look at Saudi Arabia, Yemen, now going into the Sahel, into the Horn of Africa, these remnants of that comet of al-Qaedaism are just sparks. They pretend to be al-Qaeda, but they look to me more like the phenomenon we faced in the 1990s in Egypt and Algeria. That is, groups that are largely locally focused, and as the general said, the question is going to be, do they become more globally focused,
right,
and then therefore do we decide to intervene?
And the question with the intervention is that, do we intervene, and maybe you want to follow up on this, Phil, do we intervene and take that risk when these groups never really have the potential to be global and to be a threat to us?
I think there's a clear parallel here to the conversations of the past couple of days about how government accesses your data. There's a difference between talking about what your government does and how it does it. So the discussion here would be, look, analytically you can look at the characteristics of terror organizations. Again, things like fundraising, explosives, but there are two that are significant. That is safe haven and visionary leadership. So let me cut to the chase. If, as Juan is suggesting, we're moving on, I agree with that, and Boko Haram leadership tomorrow, and they do have what I would call safe haven in northern Nigeria, says, really the head of the snake is the United States, and we are planning operations against the United States, is that, and I think that's a fair question to ask the American people and the Congress, is that significant enough to target? One last word. If the answer is no, I'd say remember Afghanistan in the 1990s.
Right.
Because the answer was no then, and we paid the price.
I would also say remember the Nigerian bomber out of London who was recruited by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to strategic surprise to try to target the U.S. And so it's very hard to predict how the threat to the homeland actually morphs amongst these groups.
Okay, so I think we have consensus that the threat looks different, that it's not centralized, it's not a bin Laden in Pakistan. It's much more, people like to use the word, it's metastasized. Okay, so I want to bring in Judge Webster and also John Ashcroft. So the concept to me seems to be that it's a network. We need a network to fight a network. It's no longer a central group or a nation state. And you've spoken extensively to me about the importance of the U.S. building new alliances. Maybe expand on that.
Well, when we talk about building alliances, I'm reminded of what has been mentioned a number of times about Bob Gates talking about getting involved in the Middle East. You got to have your head examined because there are difficulties in understanding who our allies really are in these smaller internecine, tribal, historic rivalry, Shiites, Sunnis, and so forth. And we find that today in Syria, we're in a difficult position. Yesterday, General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, tried to demur to saying what he thought versus what the president thought, and had his reappointment threatened by John McCain. The problems that I see when we are sending, not boots on the ground yet, but sending weapons and armament and other supplies to people to combat these organizations, particularly focused on in Syria and Assad, we're sending them to people who we find may not really be like us, maybe Taliban, maybe actually controlling their. It's a different messed up scheme of things that I think we have to be very careful how we proceed. And we understand who our friends are and what they stand for and what we're prepared to do over there. Sooner or later, we're going to have to get back to the discussion of our security here at home, as well as our embassies and our investments in other parts of the world.
I'm going to bring in John Ashcroft. One of the things that I'm hearing from the panel is that we're seeing the emergence of these new safe havens or new training grounds. People keep coming back to Syria in the sense that we're seeing large numbers of Western Europeans now going to Syria and joining that fight. From a law enforcement perspective, how do you try and bring to bear these relationships the United States has with these other countries when it's hard to know from one year to the next who will be in power and whether they really have the capability to work with us on these issues?
Well, I think the foundation of our security is information. And I want to say this, that the disparities that exist in the community and the dynamic of the community, so that what is hardcore at one time becomes less so at another time in the absence of clear ideological leadership, or someone else then assumes the leadership, and there's a base, there's a fertile ground and from which hardcore can spring. So I think we can, that really emphasizes the need for intelligence. And so we can ill afford to shrink intelligence in the face of a world which is, I think, more demanding of intelligence. Information is the best friend of prevention. I think sometimes when we are forced into sort of a discussion that we're either going to treat this militarily or we're going to treat it as a law enforcement issue, we are being pushed into a trick question. We need a blended response. And I think you all have probably discussed this in my absence, which is the most productive way to discuss things. I really believe that our internal security is no longer something that can be managed exclusively from inside the United States. It's the biggest lesson I learned in 9/11, that seemingly less threatening settings like Hamburg in Germany and were places where things directly related to our well-being were being undertaken. And your particular sensitivity, as you have written about the connectivity that comes with the social media and all, means that there are what might be today less threatening settings, which might become very active and threatening and mobilized pretty quickly to hurt us. So I think we're going to have a blended response, if you will. We need to continue to have our military very active and ready to be active. I don't think we should shrink from using it. I think we're still at war. I don't know if I'll be able to be sure to say when we're not at war, but as long as they're continuing to hit us and they're continuing to do things and allege that they're at war, I think we can. I'm a little unsettled when the president says he's fighting 2 wars, because I think the authorization to use military force suggests only one, and he ought to have clear authorization to fight the 2nd war. I think it's just his rhetorical way of categorizing the difference between Afghanistan and Iraq and the general war on terror. So these are very difficult matters. I would say we need to focus on preventing in the United States. That means we've got to have increased intelligence, not less intelligence, internationally, and we have to be robust in our intelligence at home.
Well, let's pick up on that intelligence point. And maybe I'm naive, but when I look at what's happening with the Arab Spring and the fallout of the Arab Spring, what I see is that our traditional relationships with these intelligence agencies in North Africa, other parts towards the Middle East, I mean, these relationships are gone, right?
Yep.
Okay, so they're gone. So, and even if these regimes want to help us, they may not be capable of helping us, and they are unstable and don't provide us the kind of consistency that we may need over time. Okay, so what do you think we have to consider? Do we have to consider more unilateral collection now?
Yeah, let me scope the problem as Catherine's laid it out. We had very rich relationships with almost all the intelligence services in the Arab world, and now you've seen what's gone on with the Arab awakening. John McLaughlin had a very classic line earlier this week in a private conversation, remembering that character Garrett Morris used to play on Saturday Night Live. It's al-Qaeda saying, the Arab Spring has been very, very good to me, okay? And so Omar Suleiman was the head of the intelligence service in Egypt, a wonderful counterterrorism partner, and not bad with working with the Palestinians either. Omar's dead. He died at the Cleveland Clinic about a year ago. Musa Kusa, the head of Gaddafi's intelligence service, visited CIA headquarters, a pretty solid counterterrorism partner. He fled Libya before Gaddafi was killed. Asif Shawkat, the intelligence chief for Assad. Surprisingly, we had marginal but productive relationships with Asif Shawkat. He was killed by a suicide bomber in his headquarters about a year and a half ago. And throughout the Arab world, these governments with whom we had tight counterterrorism relationships, they're gone. And it's not so much they don't want to cooperate, it's as Catherine suggested, there's nobody home. And yeah, I mean, you pull that liaison force lever we used to pull, and there's nothing on the other end. And so, if we are going to get the kind of granular intelligence that the Attorney General has suggested we need, we're going to have to use other tools, and that could be national technical means. But this kind of stuff, you really need to be done at the granular, tactile level, and need to have folks on the street. And that seems to me to lead you in the direction of, one, reestablishing those security services as quickly as we're able to help. And number two, relying a bit more on American unilateral reporting in areas of the world where we've got linguistic and cultural challenges.
Judge Webster, you have the benefit of having run the FBI and the CIA. If we made a pivot towards more human intelligence collection, that sounds easy, but in practice, how difficult is that to do?
Well, human intelligence always has been and always will be vitally important to our national security. You understand, through that means we have a better sense of what are their intentions, what are their capabilities, and who are they. I'm more concerned in today's world, though, that we confront the evolving nature of the ability to do harm, not only overseas to us, but here in the United States, and our ability to detect it and, if possible, prevent it. And of course, I'm talking about cybersecurity, I'm talking about the other things we've been talking about yesterday, and with that, bringing the American people along with us to understand the importance of getting that information and knowing that it is being done in a way that is respectful of our constitutional requirements, which is a big order. So the means are evolving, the means of damage and the means of detection are evolving. But human intelligence, in answer to your question, will always be at the base, our fundamental means of getting there and understanding it accurately.
Just one quick comment.
Sure, of course, please.
I think the issue isn't simply the ability to apply resources to that area, and I agree that's a problem. I think the problem is, in the past, if you're looking at a Cold War era, you have a target that doesn't move that quickly.
Good point.
In this common era, in this era of globalized threats, you have a target that when I sat at the table, you know, the U.S. government might say the big threat in '03 is Indonesia. We had a problem in the southern Philippines. You keep going, we're going to say Saudi Arabia is a serious problem in '04, '05. What about Yemen? That was a significant problem in '09. How about Somalia, where kids went from Minneapolis? Now we're into Mali and Nigeria. I don't agree, by the way, that we're at war. I do agree we have an adversary that moves with agility. So if you want to invest in Arabic and now your problem's in Somalia, you got a problem.
Yeah, please.
It's hard for us to take the actions we're taking if we're not at war. I mean, the deployment of lethal force against people who are critical in the attacks and launching attacks against our people overseas and the like, it's hard for us to say that we can defend them. I guess it's possible, you know, the president's always been able to defend the United States on his own authority. The prize cases indicate that, and so I guess if you want to smoke somebody who's, in spite of the fact we're not at war with them, we can still eliminate them.
Please.
Yeah, but war suggests an existential threat to the United States. I wouldn't put terrorism in the top 10 threats to the United States right now. If you compare it to things like
well, Mr.
drugs,
Letterman, what are your top 10 threats?
We don't have time for that.
Things like synthetic
moving on,
drugs,
no.
synthetic drugs, childhood obesity. The cartels in this country are a much more significant threat. We don't smoke cartel leaders, although I personally would probably support it. But
let me just use a
Yeah,
little
go ahead.
latitude. Okay? It's just, we're only like
At the
20
end,
minutes
we can-
into it, okay? Right. But let me just, I just want to
Do you smoke former attorneys general?
Okay, not too much fun
about
here,
90.
okay? We're having a serious discussion. Okay, Phil, I take your point, because we've talked about this when and we heard it from Mike Leiter, and we heard it from, Matt Olson and Peter Bergen, that when you actually look at the number of deaths in the United States related to terrorism since 9/11, it's less than 2 dozen. And to John Ashcroft's point, the circumstances are changing right now. We're drawing down militarily, and okay, I'm simplifying it, but we took the fight to them. We were disrupting them. We were putting them under pressure. So this idea that we want to take our foot off the pedal may seem a little premature, because when you look at a Boston, we're going to get to that in a second, but just in passing, when you look at a Boston, if you look at almost any state here in the country, on that date in April, you'll see that more people were killed in car accidents. But the difference is the way something like a Boston resonates. So maybe it's not one of the top 10 threats in terms of the body count, but this is the psychological impact on, I think especially so when you have American citizens who are carrying out these attacks against their fellow citizens. And that is one of the ways the threat has changed. Go
Can I
ahead.
jump in here? 'Cause
Yeah.
I agree with Phil to an extent here, which is we need a sense of a threat taxonomy, right? We can't overreact. I'm coming your way, sir.
I can't get anywhere.
No, but
Can't move.
But the problem is it discounts the reality of the threats that we've been able to disrupt given what we've done.
Not for a lack of trying on their part.
And the adaptations
Right.
that they've had, right? So you can imagine this conversation being very different if the 2006 airplane plot had gone off.
Right.
With 10 airlines being shot down or blown up over the Atlantic. A very different conversation if Najib Bouazizi gets on the New York subway system and blows those up. A very different conversation if the Times Square bomber succeeds, which, by the way, was launched not by Al-Qaeda core, not by an Al-Qaeda regional affiliate, but by Tariq-e-Taliban, unknown to us in terms of strategically trying to hit the heart of New York. So the conversation would be very different, and I think we tend to have the luxury of having disrupted and been relatively successful and lucky to have this kind of a conversation. And that's why I said when the president gave his speech, some of these forecastings of the end of the war, the tides of war receding are projections of luxury because we've been successful. And so I think my only concern is, given the growing space that we heard about, given the concerns, these groups adapt. They adapt, they collaborate. We've seen that with Boko Haram and AQIM. They collaborate in terms of subsistence, doing criminal activity, engaged in drug trafficking. We've seen that with AQIM as well. And it allows them the space to innovate. And you've seen this with Jabhat al-Nusra, which in some ways is becoming a social organization and not just a militant arm, which is the lesson learned by Al-Qaeda and the Taliban as to how not to operate and to ensure to win the hearts and minds of people. And so that space gives people, our enemy, a chance to adapt, to innovate, and to have the breathing space to actually become a threat to the
Okay,
U.S.
I want to give Phil a chance to respond and then come back to Mike, because I think he had a point.
You know, I think I think it's a false distinction. Why, in order to conduct a kinetic attack, why do you have to be at war? I don't see why we can't pursue these guys and have a sort of conversation about who is legitimate for a hit list, and then have to say, well, that means we have to authorize an act that says the entire United States government is at war. I mean, I have 10 nieces and nephews. I don't think I've ever talked about terrorism to them. But you know, they've got friends in high school who are pregnant. It's a problem. Synthetic drugs are all over the quarters in their high schools, and the gang problems in the city I live in, Memphis, Tennessee, are outrageous. People in this country, partly because there's a racial divide in this country, don't care. But 4 people die in an attack, and this is a national disaster. I don't get it.
I want to
Oh, wait,
say
Mike was
why
next?
to get
Okay.
it.
Oh, okay, Mike, then you.
I just, yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
Are we done yet?
Oh, no, halfway.
I don't think a binary distinction is necessary. The Republic has a suite of tools available. Some have to do with U.S. criminal law. others have to do with acting in accordance with armed conflict. And so I would suggest to you the metaphor we're looking for here is a dial, not a switch. And that I would support, we need to dial differently today than we did 10 years ago, but I don't need to go like that.
Well, we used a blended approach previously. We took Moussaoui through the criminal justice system. We took the shoe bomber through the criminal justice system. So over and over again, we've used the criminal justice system alongside the military system. I just want to say that if we're going to have body count as a definer of the threats to the United States, then aging. That's
the ultimate threat, I guess,
I'm
isn't
more
it?
keenly
Aging.
aware of it than some people are here. And what we've got to do, if this is a security discussion, I think, the size of the sodas in New York probably isn't what we ought to focus on.
No, I think there's a simpler way to characterize it. In 2001, we would have said terrorism is a potential threat to American families. And I would say today that's not true.
Okay.
Well, there were some families in Boston that found it a threat, and I think it's important to note that, but for the disruption of certain other threats, and I think one of the most dangerous things we can do is to say that it's not a threat.
Okay, so let's talk about, we were going to use sort of two real-world examples now that we've all agreed that the threat has changed. And we've all agreed that it takes a network to fight a network, right? Right. Okay, so let's do Boston. Let's talk about Boston first, because that's the real-life example of the homegrown threat. And we're in agreement that that's a new element to the threat that we've been predicting now really since, I want to say, our friend Charlie Allen really started to put it on the map in 06, 07. Judge Webster, you've been so civil. So civil. Do you see Boston as sort of one of the new TTPs, one of the new modes of terrorism? And if so, given that it's not on a scale of 9/11, how do we counteract that?
Well, some of the things that we can track back to realize go back to 9/11. Big deal, and it was a big deal. But we began to realize that there were people who were prepared to give themselves up in order to do more damage to others. The suicide bomber, the risk taker, the people in the two that we were dealing with in Boston, self-radicalization has been something we've been studying in Homeland Security ever since the Homeland Security Department was established.
And you've been on the Homeland Security Advisory Council now, what, 12 years?
From the beginning.
From the beginning.
And we have been watching this, and we have a task force now on faith-based activity. We have Muslim members, we have others, because we can't make any radical, simple, simplistic say, it's all about this. The diversity in our country creates as much vulnerability as it does enhancement of opportunity. And I think we have to pay attention to these things taking place. A lot of damage being done, and the means that we have to take not only to follow up in law enforcement and find those responsible, and I thought they did a tremendous job in doing that, and using every available piece of information to find out who these people were and where they came from and so on, only to find out they'd already had some kind of warning from the Soviet Union. So there's that from the late Soviet Union.
This same thing.
What I'm trying to say is it's with us, and it will always be with us. The means will change. The ability to do harm. That was the system there did a lot of damage to human beings. Mm-hmm. And we have to be able to get the information in order to move quickly. I hope most of you were able to hear General Alexander last night confronting what I now see as a kind of American backlash. You mean you all are watching what we do and know our telephone calls and all the other things that you're doing? We have to be able to explain how we got there, how we're doing it, and I thought he did a great job of explaining that. But it's not clear to the American people that we as Americans are doing this in the way Americans should be doing it, and that is by a process in conformity with the rule of law. We don't put the rule of law aside. We use the rule of law to permit us to take legitimate steps to protect the American people. And that's what I think Boston is telling us a little bit about. We're finding out things that we didn't know before. And we need more, and we hope we can talk about this, we need more process, not the secrets, not all the information that we have to do secretly in order to get there, and as he pointed out, not to tell the bad guys how we're doing it so they'll do it a different way. But we need to have a process that the American people can support it in saying, I know they are doing this in the right way, whether it involves FISA judges or whether it involves a covert action process such as we have with the National Security Council, where these covert means of attacking the people who are attacking us is being managed in a system that comports with the rule of law. And that we are doing that, for example, in covert action, through the process of bringing the various agencies together. The CIA is asked to produce one of these when military can't do it, when the diplomats can't do it. They come up with a system, it's vetted, it's challenged, and the president makes a finding. He makes a finding and he tells the intelligence committees of the Congress in secret what we're about to do. And yet the American people are comfortable with that because they know there is a process in which their rights as citizens are not being overrun in the name of something they don't fully understand, terrorism, call it whatever you will. And, and the broader implication of that is how our world allies feel about how we do business. We know that we're gathering intelligence, they're gathering intelligence, but we're doing it in a way that is in our way, the American way. Now, I'm getting myself way off your question, I think.
But it was also interesting.
Well, I thank you. But I think a lot of people were wondering about this.
Well, you're getting to a bigger question about moral authority and moral leadership, which is one of the big cards the United States has to play. And I want to come back to that when we wrap up. So, Mike, when we look at Boston, I mean, is that the new flavor here in the U.S.? And do you think that we're going to see an increase in those attacks, or do you think it's going to kind of plateau? I mean, what most of you may not realize is that if you follow the Justice Department as I do, there's typically a case that's filed with allegations of homegrown terrorism about every 2 to 3 weeks in this country. You don't hear a lot about it, but that's pretty much the standard. This was a case where it was not disrupted.
Yeah, I think you need to look at Boston in a little bit of perspective. Boston was a tragedy. It was not a catastrophe. And I'll bet you most people in the room here, before we learned about the Tsarnaev brothers, you were having trouble, like I certainly was, distinguishing Boston from a high-end crime or a low-end terrorist attack. And if we keep our adversaries playing in that zone, it frankly is a measure of great success, that we have taken other tools and approaches away from our adversaries. But there's a point at which, and the Tsarnaev brothers are probably at that point, where unless you're willing to give up fundamental aspects of our national way of life, that's the cost of being free. Okay?
Right.
You know, we can, should the FBI guys have gone to the mosque? You know, all those other questions. Let me just tell you a formulation I use when I get to that question. All right. Okay, you can prove to me that this Boston was preventable, but I will assure you that a Boston was inevitable. All right. And so this stuff's going to happen. This ball was going to end up in the back of the net sooner or later. And Mike Leiter and I actually talked about this long before Boston. We have to be careful by our response to not go spasmodic and give the enemy a strategic victory when all they have achieved, as tragic as it was, as a minor tactical success. I'll give you one other thought too. I think one of the subtexts of what we're talking about here is we're going to be a little less on our forward foot here in fighting terrorism. All right, we got big Army, big Navy, big Air Force, largely out of the game. They're coming home. The president has put some very strict restrictions in the NDU speech as to what constitutes legitimate targeting outside of agreed theaters of conflict. If we put less weight on our front foot, which frankly I think has created that reality where the enemy's playing in this zone.
Is that the drawdown you're really referring to? Okay,
right. Then we're going to have more weight on our back foot. In other words, we've been largely successful, I think, because we've been playing offense for 10 years. If we were going to play offense less robustly, we need to tend a bit more to defense.
And does that mean we see more, Juan, I'll bring you in, does that mean that we see more Bostons? Do you think that's the logical result of that?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Sorry, but either one.
Go ahead.
No, I think the general's already answered. I think that's the case, and I think you try to prevent it. To the general's point, I think one of the great lessons and one of the great results of Boston was the resilience that we showed. You know, the message of Boston Strong. Right. The fact that we didn't overreact. There was lots of oversight, lots of questions. Could we have done better? Of course, but we didn't eat our own, so to speak. And so I think that was a great maturation, and credit to the Obama administration, because they've been talking about the need for resilience for some time, and we did as well, but they really took that theme up. But I think Boston also underscores, and Catherine, this goes to your question, it underscores the importance of ideology. And the reason that we've got to watch what happens overseas is not just that somebody could get on a plane and blow it up over Detroit or in New York, but it's because the ideology can inspire people among us or near us to attack. And watching the ideological adaptations matters quite a bit as well. And I worry because there are two things happening in that context. One, in the context of Syria and the Levant, you have not just terrorists and al-Qaeda operating there, foreign fighters we heard yesterday from the NCTC panel, but it's being construed in the context of the Sunni-Shia fight. And that's always been an undercurrent. But it's now coming to the fore. And it's coming to the fore with state sponsorship, and it's coming to the fore in a way that's attracting foreign fighters from all over the world. And the ideology itself is adapting. The other driver is our withdrawal in 2014. The jihadists, or the violent jihadists, have been preparing for this moment for years. They've been preparing the narrative battle space. And they're trying to portray it as the defeat of the American superpower, just like it was the defeat of the Soviets. And so I think it's very important that as we think about, and talk about, and move toward the drawdown, that we think about the ideological narrative and how that impacts what happens around the world. Because it's not just anymore what happens in Kandahar or Mogadishu or whatever. It's what happens on the internet and how the ideology itself can inspire people among us to attack.
Just one observation that I have is that there does seem to be something very revolutionary going on with social media, because when you look at the homegrown cases in the United States, what you see is that almost everyone who's involved with them is largely under 30. Major Nidal Hasan at Fort Hood was a bit of an outlier. He was in his late 30s, and he'd also had some person-to-person contact with the cleric Anwar al-Awlaki. But generally speaking, when you look at these cases, they're under 30, and there's always that social media component. So it does seem that this sort of the old idea that you had to have in-person contact, kind of the mentoring thing, to strap on a suicide belt, to go on your own personal jihad, that seems to have changed. It seems that it's possible to do it in a virtual way, and that really was, it seemed evident to me in Boston. Go ahead.
I don't think that's accurate. It's partly accurate. I don't think that's accurate because when you look at plots, and as you suggested, if the American people saw the volume of threat every day, for example, at the Bureau, I think they'd be surprised. They see a little peak now and then. They don't see the noise below, which is constant. But I think the internet's misunderstood because what I saw typically, and you'd see the same, for example, in Britain or in Canada, and we did, was that there was an older brother or father figure who served as the person bringing the not the cell, but the cluster to, yes, correct. Okay. And then the internet served as the accelerant.
Oh, okay.
For example, the cluster did not know what they were doing. They were not a cell yet. And someone would say, look at this dead kid in Gaza. Don't we need to avenge that? And so you start look at this woman who's violated in Afghanistan. So that image and maybe contact with people overseas would accelerate the development of the cluster, but the cluster started with human interaction.
Okay, so just to sort of recap here, so we all agree the threat's changed, right? We all agree it takes a network to fight a network, right? And if we don't want the government more in our business, we are likely to see more Bostons, something along those lines. Okay.
May
so,
I just toss
yeah,
one
please.
thing? We've got an opportunity that's yet unrealized or harvested in the United States, and that's the state and local law enforcement community, which has to be motivated to cooperate with our national intelligence at the FBI and our other sources given the fact that we have a more and more disparate, if it's not a bigger threat, it's a more disparate threat in a lot of ways. I think continuing to focus on bringing those people into, and many times what we see happening in these things that are below the radar of the prosecutions, they are coming from state and local people originally as tips, and it's very important that we cultivate those sources.
But isn't one of the conclusions from Boston that you can't legislate a culture change? I mean, there was a failure to share important information between the FBI on the JTTF and the local police.
Yeah, while we're busy, we shouldn't break our arm patting ourselves on the back for
Right.
Boston. It is good that it wasn't a bigger tragedy, although for the families that lost people, it's a pretty big tragedy, and those who are maimed for life, they're tragedies. There are things that we can learn from Boston that should help us improve. There are very serious questions to ask, and we were pretty good on remediation, but we were not very good on prevention, and looking back, we might have been better on prevention. So we ought to look at Boston as a learning exercise, as well as, yes, we can call it a success that we're at this level. One last little tack on there.
Okay.
I don't ever want to think that because we held Boston to this level that we get the idea that it's okay. There's not a single one of those that would be okay with me. And it is a measure of our success, but it still stands as a challenge.
Mike, did you have a point?
I just want to, as the Attorney General suggests, think about Boston lessons learned. Let me toss out a thought, all right? And it's overstated, okay? I'm self-incriminating here at the beginning, all right? If the Sanayas lived in New York, the attack would not have been successful. There is a different local law enforcement mentality in New York than in any other city, except perhaps Los Angeles to some degree, in the United States. And because of that, Chief Ray Kelly has been the subject of multiple Pulitzer Prize winning, whining articles in the Associated Press, okay, about what he does
I have no comment on
with
that.
regard to civil liberties and mosque crawling and so on. And I would just offer you the view that if they're living in the Bronx, they show up on the radar of the local police.
Okay, so we're going to move on from Boston to sort of the other real-world example where terrorists have attacked U.S. interests, and that's the Benghazi example. What we now know, if you're not familiar with the Vanity Fair reporting and our own reporting at Fox, is that it does seem the attack had a fairly significant level of premeditation. The people who accessed the consulate seemed to either have had inside information about the layout of the consulate, or there had been some reconnaissance that they had done. They used hand signals. They had the kind of, I hesitate to use the word battlefield skills, but these were the kinds of skills they could pick up in sort of Assyria now, these days, in terms of their training. So Judge Webster, in your view, the attack in Benghazi, does it kind of check all the boxes for what the threat may look like to us now overseas?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. I thought the question really in Benghazi was our readiness to recognize what was a terrorist event or a civil protest.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's going to take some real attention and a readiness to see beyond what we'd like to think or what would be, and that gets back to my original thing, and I don't want to drag it back in yet, about the American people's understanding and what we're telling the American people about what we're doing and getting the American people to accept the conditions that are necessary for us to have the information and to act on it appropriately. We need to level with the American people in every way that we can, just as I think we failed to do in the Benghazi issue. And we need to do it in a way that we will not be able to provide all of the gory details, but so that they know that their interests as American citizens are being carefully monitored and protected as we do the hard business of getting at these conspiracies, at these activities.
Mike, and I want to bring you in. What do you think the ramifications are to our response in Benghazi?
You know, we need to be participatory in this very revolutionary part of the world. And the president's made a decision which I think many of our countrymen agree that we're not going to be participatory with large brigades or regimental combat teams. Right? And so we've got to have a footprint there. And that would lead you to the diplomatic footprint and diplomacy writ large, economic ties, business ties, and so on, aid and assistance. But even there, we're drawing down. I mean, the original plan when we went to zero in Iraq was for, I believe, 17,000 State Department officers and contractors. And we are well below that and have abandoned several consulates that we were going to have in Iraq. Same thing is happening in Afghanistan. We have consulates under construction that we have stopped construction on because we will not occupy them. So there's, besides the military withdrawal, there's an overall withdrawal of the American footprint, and I fully recognize the dangers, but we are abdicating the field to these actors I suggested earlier said, you know, the Arab Spring's been very, very good to me. And so I think one of the things that Benghazi shows is it's very dangerous, but we still have to sustain our commitment in one form or another.
I think a fundamental issue that Benghazi raises, though, and it goes to the heart of this panel, is how we think about the enemy and how we think about terrorist threat. Because I think, as Matt Olson referred to yesterday, part of the challenge in the Benghazi debate is how do you talk about the terrorist threat? How do you talk about the attack if you can't understand it through the classic al-Qaeda prism, right? Because there was al-Qaeda involvement, but it wasn't necessarily all al-Qaeda. How do you understand the safe haven in Derna in eastern Libya, which has well over 1,000 fighters and Salafi extremists? Is that a terrorist threat to the United States? I don't know. And so I think one of the core questions with Benghazi and moving forward in terms of our security and our response is, how do we start to view the threats and the blending of these groups and individuals, some of whom may be directed by al-Qaeda, some of whom may be inspired by the ideology, some of whom may just be inspired by the opportunities arising to kill Americans or to make a profit. How do you think about that, and what resources do you put against it? One note of opportunity here, because I want to sort of associate myself with something that Attorney General Ashcroft said.
It's dangerous.
What you have with the metastasizing the movement, everything we've talked about in terms of network, is the opportunity to battle with the network. One of the things that we've started to do well, and you see this with the DEA, is to use overseas law enforcement capabilities to go after some of these networks and cells before they become a problem. And so thinking differently about what that blend is, how you turn the dial is very important, but thinking about how you use law enforcement very aggressively in that context, because the fact that some of these groups are now engaged in high-stakes criminality, drug trafficking, hostage-taking, bank robberies, that gives you an opportunity to leverage local, regional law enforcement networks and resources that haven't been part of the war narrative, but are clearly part of a response to deal with a networked enemy.
There are sort of two aspects of these problems to me. One is the prevention, and the other is the remediation. How we think about things is very important in how we design our prevention strategy, but we should never let that how we think about an organization keep us from seeing the real facts that emerge when something happens. So yes, how we think about things will help us in our design for prevention. The facts that we encounter ought to help us design our approach to remediation. And I think what we had a little bit of a problem is we get so committed that we think it's not terrorism or we're not at war. We sometimes are blind to the facts which would belie those preconceptions about what something was supposed to be. And the terrorist isn't sitting around saying, now we've got to fit ourselves into a cubbyhole that is the dimensions of which are the intellectual conception that the other guys have of us. As a matter of fact, if they figure out how we're thinking about them, they're going to adjust their conduct to make sure that they operate in a different way. So when it happens, we at least ought to be willing to learn from the experience.
I just want to have one follow-up with you on the law enforcement question, because the administration has taken a law enforcement approach to attempting to detain and prosecute those who are responsible for Benghazi. You've talked about a blended approach. Do you think this can be an effective approach?
Well, I think that's fact-based. You know, and if
I guess what I'm getting at is
one
that,
of the reasons we wanted to take a blended approach was that we wanted to demonstrate to countries around the world that we were willing to take it. And some folks, if they get custody of someone that we know is very dangerous and threatening to us, they won't give them to us or otherwise cooperate with us if they don't think that we'll use the criminal justice system. So when we were trying to send policy and structural signals, one of the things we sought to do by showing that we could handle these things in different ways. And there are a number of people who I prefer, because I'm still the subject of lawsuits on these things, that were taken as enemy combatants and then moved into the criminal justice system, may have been moved back into the other system, and these are not mutually exclusive.
but let me just jump in here on Benghazi. You know, there has been a complete lack of cooperation with the United States in bringing around these people. In Tunisia, we had FBI agents who were harassed, even trying to speak to a suspect who was ultimately released. Juan, maybe?
I think, and I've been to Libya 4 times in the last year, I think this goes to a lack of capability by the central government to actually enforce its writ on the people in the area where these people are. And I think that creates a huge dilemma for the administration. The administration has pledged to bring these people to justice. What does that mean in the context of a veritable safe haven, where frankly we know who some of those people are? The Libyans themselves may not be able to grab them. We're certainly not going to be able to grab them and bring them to New York to have them face trial. So what do you do? What do you do? And I think that's an issue of credibility. When the president says they're going to be brought to justice, when the attorney general says that we're getting close, do we actually have the means, do we have the political and diplomatic will and the partnership to actually effectuate that? And I think that's a critical question. Actually, one of the lingering, I think, substantive elements of the Benghazi debate that gets lost amongst the politics of it.
Phil.
A quick comment on this. Juan raises a great point. It relates to what General Hayden said, and that is capability. If you accept the premise that one of the indicators of a terrorist threat is safe haven combined with visionary leadership, and you look at the swath of instability, by instability I mean places, simply put, where governments don't have the capability to exert power, in the space of a few years you're going from Iraq, now into Syria, I think possibly into Lebanon, you're going down through the Sinai, which is a significant problem these days, it has a jihadi presence, through Egypt, and into North Africa and down to Mali. That is a huge expanse of territory. And to close with the dial point that the general made, to me, this is why we can't simply apply a switch, because the speed with which a group might emerge in this safe haven with good leadership to say, actually, I got 10 guys I can get to New York. You know, one year it's in Indonesia, the next year it's Yemen, now it's Mali. We're going to have to figure out how to react to that so that we're not too late, and we'll have to be agile.
Judge Webster, I'm going to give you the final thought before we open it up to questions.
The final thought?
The final thought of the esteemed panel.
I think years ago, when I came to the FBI in 1978, the former agents were looking for something to put on the walls of a building that's now obsolete, or so I'm told. And most of them had to do with law and order, and other words that were going through an evolving period, just as we are now. But the quotation from J. Edgar Hoover that we jointly selected has really been acted out in real life over the years. So the key to effective law enforcement is cooperation at all levels of government and with the support and understanding of the American people. And that's the thing that I think we have to really focus on, because security is always too much in this country. We don't like it, it's too much. When we find out that we've got NSA collecting vast amounts of information, we get worried about it. It's always too much until the day it's not enough. And that's the challenge that we have, those of us that have responsibilities to protect America, either by military, diplomatic, covert actions, or intelligence gathering. But we must have the support of the American people, and they respond to an understanding of how we're doing it in ways that comport with the traditions that Americans like to think of themselves, who we are. We must not compromise our standards of respect for the individuals and our families and our country and the rights of others and our liberties. On the other hand, we must understand that we have collectively the responsibility to work together, state and local and federal, and we're learning to do that. The fusion centers, the counterterrorist centers, all the other things that are going on in this country have had a remarkable effect on the statistical outcome. But none of it is worth it. We lose it in a minute if we don't always involve the American people in understanding how this works, and that we are protecting our rights and our principles, and when we do that, we're protecting our country.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got about 10 to 15 minutes to open it up for questions. I've been sort of ignoring the side of the room, so the gentleman over here, please.
Stuart Bernstein, former American ambassador to Denmark. Excellent presentation. Why are we the bad guys? We're a great country and we're great people. Is it why America? What is it? What are the values that we have that they are against us? And is Europe included in this, or is it just America?
Okay, so we'll have one person take this question. Who would like to take it?
Is it theologian?
Oh, don't all jump now.
I'm
Okay.
happy to try at least.
Okay.
Why do they hate us, right? You have to remember that Al-Qaeda was an intellectual, theological vanguard, right? They view themselves and this broader movement as representing the oppressed Muslims of the world. And the narrative there is that the U.S., as the head of the snake, has led an effort to not only keep the great history of Islam down, but to actually harm Muslims, and that anything that goes wrong around the world is actually our fault. And if you look at the narrative, by the way, even the times when the U.S. has come to the defense of Muslim communities in Bosnia, Kuwait, Afghanistan, and the Afghan Mujahideen, that is twisted in a way to blame us for the deaths and destruction there. And it's not just us, it's Europe as well. Ayman al-Zawahiri, now Al-Qaeda's leader, once said he wanted Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb to be the bone in the throat of the French. And certainly we've seen with French activity in Mali that the French have been now the target, including the last statement from Zawahiri, target of much of the vitriol. So it's the notion of sort of the West and the West's oppression of Muslim communities that really is at the heart of this, with the Al-Qaeda narrative blended on top to say we have to defend Muslims and attack forward. That's really the ideological, theological innovation of Al-Qaeda, which frankly still persists in these groups.
Gosh, I need my glasses right here in the front, please. Yes. Okay, please.
Thank you. Chris Isham from CBS. Hi. Follow up on what Juan was saying in Boston. The enemy there clearly was ideology. It was not an organization headquartered in Waziristan. It was an ideology. My question is, are we doing enough to counter that ideology? Could we be doing more?
Who would like to take that?
I'll start.
Okay.
No, we're not.
And why not?
Because it's a difficult ideology for a Judeo-Christian society to get involved in a deep dialogue. The way I draw this is that fundamentally, let's compare it to the Cold War, all right? So you had military strength, it was useful. But it was useful only in moving the game to the level of big ideas, because that's where you had to win it. And whatever you think of Marxism, it's a Western philosophy. You know, German wrote it in a library in London. All right? It is a product of our civilizational stream. Okay? And I understand we're a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, but fundamentally Judeo-Christian in our values and in our population. So how do we, with legitimacy, comment on what constitutes the appropriate view of the Quran or of the Hadith and so on? So this is a much more difficult one for us to affect the deep battle. My last week in government, we had a successful operational act and taking the terrorists off the battlefield, and Rahm Emanuel kind of poked me in the back and said, hey, really good stuff. And knowing Rahm, I should have just said thank you and left. Okay, but I figured I wasn't going to talk to this guy ever again. So I said, Rahm, this is a counterterrorism success. Unless you get to change the facts on the ground, you get to do this forever. And so what most of us up here have done has created space for political evolution to take place, but it's hard for us to actuate it the way we may have done in Eastern Europe. In this particular conflict, it's got to come from within. And as bad as the turmoil of the Arab awakening was, I think all of us would agree, all those fellows I said we were cooperating with, they were serving governments that were speeding in a cul-de-sac. Okay, those governments were not going to survive. We wish we could have done the transition in a more smooth way. So for as bad as the Arab awakening is, this may actually be what it is you're hoping for.
Could I just throw out an idea? Is it me, or do we seem uncomfortable about getting into the battle of ideas? This idea of propaganda. I mean, do we sort of shrink from that, or what do you think, Judge Webster?
We don't know how to talk about it, but propaganda is a pejorative term. But getting your message there is very important. Just a little aside, one of the things that we did in the CIA as a covert process, widely accepted, we had the Federalist Papers reprinted, attributed to another source in other parts of the world, distributed to third world countries that were on the margin between the Soviet Union and the free world. They were gobbled up because these were ideas that they were searching for, and they were finding support. We didn't take the credit for it. We didn't want the credit for it. But they were the Federalist Papers.
Oh, interesting.
Can I jump in just really quickly? Because we've struggled with this for a long time. And the U.S. government, as the General said, not capable, not comfortable, constitutionally not even sort of in a position to be debating theologically these things. But what we've tried to do, and I think this has been a continuous strategy, is find credible voices and actors and networks who can speak to this. Leslie Stahl did a great piece for 60 Minutes called The Narrative, which touched on a lot of this. And I think that becomes the key. How can you animate those networks in a very positive way? And one final point on this. One of the successes of the Iraqi surge was the fact that you had an ideological counterweight and push from the heart of al-Qaeda's constituency, the Sunni Arab tribes. And I remember at the time hearing and seeing some of the rhetoric from them, and it was the most anti-al-Qaeda ideological propaganda that you would have seen. And it came from the heart of their constituency. And that's what you have to see.
John, did you have something?
Yeah, there is a fundamental problem between a government which prides itself on being secular, which is who we are, getting involved in a religious debate. And there is a radical Muslim identity in much of terrorism in the world. I think what we need to do, however, is to not restrain our culture from being involved in the debate. And sometimes our government is so eager to promote a secular environment that it labels as politically incorrect those who get involved in the debate and sort of pressures them and squelches the debate. And so, because we are governmentally, and properly so in my judgment, incapable of debating those kinds of issues, we end up immobilizing other resources in the culture which should be involved in the expression of this debate. Otherwise, the debate isn't undertaken.
Quick.
Very quickly. One of the odd things about this grand debate is that we're sitting in a country more religious than Saudi Arabia. Right? In terms of people going to mosque or going to church, we dwarf any other Islamic country. And we are the only postmodern Western democracy that fundamentally allows religion into the public square. Go figure. And we're still the head of the snake.
All right, thank you. Good question, thank you. Yes, right here in the white jacket. Yep, hi. We probably have time for maybe one more question after
Thank
this.
you. Terrific, really great conversation, I felt. You've touched on Syria a bit, but obviously, we keep hearing about what a toxic mix it is when you have the will and you have the haven. And of course, if Syria splits up, we're going to see this really witch's brew breaking out there with Al-Qaeda with a very nice place to sort of reassemble. What does the panel think about what we should be doing with Syria? Has that ship sailed? Suddenly Assad is, he's hanging on. He's now an ascendant warlord. What happens there, and how dangerous does that become to American security?
Thank you for the question, Phil. Why don't you begin?
A couple quick thoughts. At a tactical level, I'd be doing a lot of collection, because as the general said, I want to know. I don't care whether they're an enemy yet. I can't wait if they turn into an enemy to develop the target package to go after them. But more strategically, a couple things. First, before we call them Al-Qaeda, I would say, prove to me that they're globalists. They say they are, but a lot of my experience is these folks say they're al-Qaeda and then they go shoot the more secular Sunnis. You have a civil war, and the bleed out we anticipated from extremists in places like Iraq 10 years ago doesn't happen. Last thing I'd say is, we haven't talked about this, the expansion of the Sunni-Shia divide, which is not a political issue, it's an emotional, visceral issue in this region. As you look at Iraq becoming not just semi-democratic, but Shia in the view of my friends in the Middle East, and you have Hezbollah transitioning out of sort of vaguely benign democracy in Lebanon and saying, actually, we are Hezbollah and we're in Syria. You have the Qataris and the Saudis on the other side. I think next year we might be talking about the expansion of the Sunni-Shia divide and what our role is.
Can I jump in here?
Yes, please.
I disagree with Phil, because I think it's clearly already part of the global terrorist milieu. You have this now as a centerpiece of the foreign fighter flows everywhere from Europe and Australia to the Chinese Uyghurs to North Africans. And so this is the cause célèbre for al-Qaeda now. And in fact, you have not just Jabhat al-Nusra, but al-Qaeda in Iraq fighting over who can carry the mantle forward, and debating actually with Zawahiri over who should lead this effort. And so I don't think we should wait to find the answer. The answer is already there. I think the question is, from a policy perspective and from a counterterrorism perspective, is this the new cradle of a resurrection of a new form of al-Qaeda? Right. And so should we be thinking about the problem differently? Not only is our policy to see the fall of Assad and perhaps some stability in Syria, but making sure that that does not become the cradle of a resurrected al-Qaeda ideology.
Right. Yeah. But just quickly to everyone, her question was, are we too late to the game? Yes or no? We'll move down the line.
We're so late to the game that it takes great energy to have any effect. A year ago, 15 months ago, pretty much at the time of the two Republican and Democratic national conventions, that would have been a good time to do this. But it will be harder to do 12 months from now than it is now.
Anyone think that we're ahead of it still? No. Okay, last question.
It will appear too late when the chemical weapons stores fall into the terrorist hands.
All right. This gentleman here. And just one of you, I think, because then we really have to. Okay, yeah.
Good morning. Michael Quigley from Human Rights First. To Mike's point about celebrating a counterterrorism success, and you get to do this for the rest of your life, that's a concern. I agree with Phil where he says that you don't need to have an AUMF, you don't need to be at war to have a kinetic option available to you. And my concern is that with a reliance on the kinetic and a reliance on the AUMF, almost an addiction for the last two administrations, we are driving a screw with a hammer, and we are underscoring and undermining we're underscoring their rhetoric and undermining our ability to affect the moderate voice, the long-term solutions, the diplomatic and capacity building opportunities that we need to do. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, please.
I don't buy it. The reason is, I don't think it's a hammer into a screw, because if we accept that we can't afford another group, as al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan in the 1990s, to develop a capability to strike, and we don't want to intervene with Big Green, and furthermore, we don't have a local partner who has the capacity or the will to intervene, I'm saying as a practitioner, I'm running out of options, dude. I'm going to shoot him.
Option. I'm not arguing the kinetic option. Not at all. Not at all. I'm sorry if that sounded that way.
Right.
What I'm saying is that reliance solely on the kinetic option, which we have been doing, is not. We're not developing, as Mike said, we are not developing the ability to affect a long-term solution to where we don't have to celebrate counterterrorism kinetic successes.
Well, it's not true that we have relied solely on the kinetic option. We wouldn't have a lot of detainees that we have if we had relied solely on the ability to exterminate people. As a matter of fact, we have apprehended, rendered, and detained a number of people that were of significant value to us. So I think it's a little bit too simplistic to say that we've had a blended and a nuanced approach. And for the guy who's on the end of a Hellfire missile, he doesn't see that as a nuance.
You have a way with words.
And maybe there are other people who wish they had been on the end of one of those more.
Okay, that's 0 minutes remaining from the left. Okay, that's it. Thank you all for coming this morning. Thank you very much.